Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, we're going to be talking about predatory publishers. We are nothing without academic integrity, and predatory publishing practices threaten to undermine a scholarly communications environment that, these days, needs public faith and trust more than ever. My guest and I will be discussing the motives, archetypes, and deceptive practices of predatory publishers, so stay tuned in this four-part series for some valuable intel to help you safely navigate the academic publishing landscape. Joining me on this series, which is brought to you with generous support from Cabells, are Ashley Carroll, Project Manager at Cabells, Ruth Bailey, Journal Auditor, Michael Bisaccio, Director of Marketing and Communications, and Yasmin Zubair, Journals Manager at Cabells. I should note that the Cabells team recently presented a webinar with Choice on predatory publishing, which is freely accessible on demand at the Choice Media channel on YouTube. In this third episode of our series, our guests describe how they evaluate and identify predatory publishers. So speaking of standards, like we talked about in the last episode, how do you break down your evaluative approach to predatory publishing? What are the key steps? And Yasmin, why don't we go over to you for that one?
Overall, the key is to be as thorough and objective as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, we collect basic information about the journal and look through select papers to get an idea of the content that the journal publishes. And some issues with peer review become obvious at this point. I believe Ruth mentioned long lists of self-citations at the end of certain articles,
Yep.
things like that. Then we analyze the journal's policies, if they post any. Many predatory journals don't bother. And we assess the journal against our criteria. As we go, we verify details, for example, indexing and other claims that the journal makes. We have to collect evidence every step of the way. And once we have collected our evidence and determined if there were any criteria violations, the evidence can be weighed. Then, taking the whole picture into account, the journal may be listed on predatory reports, along with all of the predatory behavior that our team noted.
Okay. So then I'm wondering if there's like a certain threshold that as you're collecting this evidence, that once you hit that threshold, then you're like, okay, we can now put it on the list.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
However, our process is as holistic as possible. And so there are some cases in which we've encountered journals that do cross the threshold, but based off of our impressions of the journal overall, holistically, we make the judgment call not to include them
Okay.
on predatory.
Right. And then, so once a journal or publisher makes a list, I mean, how do you broadcast that out? I mean, how do folks find that out as quickly as possible, I imagine?
So if a journal meets our criteria for being considered predatory, and we believe that they have this intent to deceive, then we add their information to our database of Cabell's predatory reports, along with the violations that we've noted.
Yep. And then, like, I imagine there's an alert or something sent out to subscribers to the database, or?
Not exactly. I feel like if we sent out an alert every time, researchers would be rather stressed. There are thousands of journals on our database, so we find that it's more helpful for subscribers to look up disciplines that they're interested in, and then
Okay, I see.
Yes, more specific.
To be more proactive on their end about it. Yeah. Okay, perfect. So then, just in general, how many behaviors has your team identified to flag predatory journals and publishers?
Our team has identified 74 criteria,
Mm-hmm.
which we use when evaluating journals.
Is that growing, or like do you discover new ones, or is it sort of stabilized?
It is stable. Our current version has these 74 criteria,
Mm-hmm.
but we are constantly taking in scholarly discourse. We're reading papers
Okay.
and keeping up with what researchers are saying about these predatory journals. And so we are working on a revised version of the criteria. It's always a work in progress. We try to keep abreast of any emerging trends and concerns that researchers have.
Okay. So that makes me think, I mean, I wonder how Cabells is able to, or if Cabells is interested in, based on its own sort of approach to the market, how are you potentially identifying publishers and journals before they're able to scam an author, for example? I mean, if a new website pops up, um, how are you able to jump on that before it does any damage, I guess, in the field?
Because the way that we evaluate journals is very evidence based, it is tricky to make a judgment call on or evaluate brand new journals.
Mm, right.
We need to make sure that they've actually done wrong and tried to scam an author before saying that they have.
Yes.
Um,
Right.
so, really, evidence is the key here.
Yep.
As far as how we find these journals, we were often tipped off by academics in the field, usually by email.
Hmm.
And this is where we get some of the best information. Uh, Researchers encounter suspicious journals during the course of their own research. But in addition to that, our team scans media reports and discourse on social media, as well as paper attractions. And we keep up with publisher press releases. We also consider predatory lists from other organizations. And so altogether, we have many ways to discover these predatory journals.
Great. Thanks, Yasmin. Ruth, I'm wondering if you could provide some more insight and detail on, more of the red flags that you're looking for as you're out there investigating these journals and publishers.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the main one, which we have discussed a bit already, is false information. So that's the most easily verifiable thing for us. So if a journal claims something that isn't true, so inclusion on an indexing list, or often putting names on editorial boards that either haven't agreed to be on the editorial boards, or they have agreed to it, but they've not been asked to do anything since being included. So all the journal will do is list their photograph and their affiliation in a way to kind of as a means of bolstering the reputation of the journal. So it looks like it's got a good, strong editorial board. Um, Another area is sort of we label academic misconduct. So publishing articles without the author's consent, or duplicate publications. That's relatively easy to discover. Um, as Yasmin mentioned, a lack of policies. So if it doesn't mention anything about what they would do if there was plagiarism or if the article needed to be retracted, sort of a general lack of approach to the ethics side of publishing.
Hmm.
Again, peer review is one of the biggest ones. If a journal offers unusually quick peer review, but it doesn't seem to have the staff to support that, some journals will say, they can review your article within a couple of days. Or we might look at an article that has stamps on for the received and the revised and the accepted dates, and often they might be all within a week of each other, which rings alarm bells. Or you might have a whole batch of articles that have got exactly the same date stamps on them, which would be really unusual even for a legitimate publisher to have that much work done in that time. Um, Another key indicator is when you have inconsistency in the publishing schedule. So you might have one volume that's got 10 issues and the next volume's got one, or one issue, the journal's got nearly 100 articles and the next one's got nothing. So it's like there's no pipeline for the journal, and they're just publishing anything as and when it comes in. That's definitely a big indicator. And that, again, in line with, say, you might have an editorial board that's got 100 people on it, but the journal's only published 2 or 3 articles. So you would wonder why there's that many people if there's no strategic direction for the journal or no pipeline of articles. So
Right.
those all together make a picture of a predatory journal.
Hmm. So it's sounding like there's quite a lot of elements that you need to look at and pay attention to and analyze. Is any part of this automated, or is it strictly a manual process?
So it's not automated. We look at, because we take each journal on an individual basis, then we we will manually go through the journal to check all of these different elements.
Hmm.
Because I think there's a danger if it was automated that you can't read the nuance. Like Yasmin mentioned, that we might have a journal that crosses the threshold for our criteria, but there might be something about that you think, actually, I think this is just a low quality journal, that they're not trying to dupe authors. They just maybe haven't got a clear picture about how this particular journal should work, or what the ethical guidelines on this should be. I mean, obviously that's still a concern for the journal, but we don't want to mark something as predatory if they're not actually intending to deceive authors. So it is a fully manual process at the moment.
Hmm. Yeah, because I was going to ask, how do you avoid misidentifying, an otherwise legitimate journal or publisher? And it's sounding like, as you've mentioned, these brand new journals that might not really understand the publishing market and not understand what goes into sort of that effort to appear legitimate or be legitimate. That could initially look like a predatory journal, but as you say, the intent isn't there. And Yasmin, I'm wondering, like, what's involved in that once you reach that juncture? Like, what are you seeing? And so you're not misidentifying an otherwise innocent publisher.
So, as my colleagues have said, our process is holistic.
Hmm.
It's really essential to make sure that we're not listing simply low quality journals or journals that are just starting out or still learning, because what we say about journals can negatively impact their reputation. And so it's really essential to get it right. That is why it's so important to have someone trained to evaluate journals to do it. We absolutely cannot automate this. And so the essence of what we look for when identifying predatory journals is the intent to deceive. That's really the key here.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Um, so this is kind of a weird question, I guess, but like, are you examining practices that are sometimes or might be arguably outside of predatory in nature? Like, I'm thinking of something that might be more exploitative, and where a large commercial interest is publishing an article that's really just kind of a PR tactic or a thinly veiled effort to sort of push um, interests in their direction, to sort of influence something that would help their product or their investment go in a certain direction. I mean, does that ever get flagged by you guys? Are you looking at that, or is that just something else entirely that really doesn't fit into your rubric? And I'm not sure who to ask that one directly to, but whoever wants to take it.
I'll take that one. I think so. Being aware of wider behaviours and activities that are part of the academic publishing and research landscape are really a part of our remit. We keep up with what's going on in the industry, new developments.
Mm-hmm.
And when we evaluate journals, we've got criteria that will look at things like conflicts of interest. So, if you've got an editor who's publishing a lot of research in his own journal or her own journal, and there's not policy to cover that, then that is something that would be a red flag for us, not necessarily as a sign of a predatory journal, but it's something we would look at generally when we're evaluating journals.
Okay.
And I mean, as we've talked about a lot, when we're reviewing journals for predatory reports, we are taking it on a case-by-case basis. So if something came up like this within a predatory journal, we saw an article that was clearly just, a veiled PR article, then that would be a detail that would go towards a larger picture. If this kind of article had been published in, say, a legitimate journal, and we had that journal listed, then that might lead us to kind of ask questions about whether that should be listed in our journalytics database. But it's not a specific behaviours that we're following up on. It's just a general awareness of what's going on in the industry and how that impacts our products, I think.
You just heard from Ashley Carroll, Project Manager at Cabells, Ruth Bailey, Journal Auditor at Cabells, Michael Basaccio, Director of Marketing and Communications at Cabells, and Yasmin Zubair, Journals Manager at Cabells. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Cabells. Join us next week when we look at how open access has impacted predatory publisher practices and what researchers need to know as they consider their publishing options. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.